Welcome to the CSAE Research Podcasts, a series of conversations about projects taking place at the Centre for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. I'm Ashley Pople, an affiliate member of the CSAE, and I'm currently working as an economist at the World Bank's Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Unit in South Asia. Humanitarian workers carry out incredible life-saving work every day on the front line of crisis response to assist those in the greatest need. Yet repeatedly, despite the fact that billions of dollars are spent annually on humanitarian support to households in crisis, there is very little evidence on the impact of the support. This project is one of the first large-scale evaluations that rigorously tests the impact of humanitarian cash transfers delivered in anticipation of a sudden extreme weather event, and the importance of being timely for an impactful response. Today, we will be discussing our research on anticipatory cash transfers in climate disaster response, a project run in partnership with the CSAE, the Centre for Disaster Protection, the World Food Programme, and UN OCHA. Joining us today to discuss the project are Stefan Dercon, Director of the CSAE and Professor of Economic Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, Ruth, Lead Economist, and Ben Brunckhorst, both in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice at the World Bank. Welcome.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you.
Hi, Ashley. Good to be here.
So a little bit of context to set the stage before we dive in. In 2020, Bangladesh experienced the second highest and second most protracted floods in decades. This extreme event had devastating impacts, but this time, a group of UN humanitarian agencies were ready for it. 2 weeks before the floods hit, a forecast-based trigger was activated, and these NGOs and agencies jumped into action. The World Food Programme, for instance, delivered 4,500 taka, which is approximately 2 weeks of food expenditure for a household, via mobile money to over 23,000 households forecast to be affected by these extreme floods in northern Bangladesh. Our evaluation focuses on measuring the impact of these anticipatory cash transfers on household welfare. So to kick us off, Stefan, can you share with us what anticipatory action is and why this approach was seen to be innovative in the context of responding to a humanitarian crisis?
Thank you, Ashley. The term anticipatory action in humanitarian response, well, it's in the words really. It's you try to anticipate and you want to act before the crisis hits. So it's basically about, can we actually get certain processes, actions, responses to happen before a particular context turns into an emergency in a real crisis. And of course, the advantages are quite clear. It's something to do with timing. You can reach people before they are really already in desperately need. So you can actually give them some resources and ways of responding. And what's then also important is that, when these emergencies happen, it's not just a number of people are in need, whole systems, whole structures, they begin to become chaotic. And by being beforehand, you allow people to plan a bit more carefully and to actually get themselves prepared before the event happens. And of course, that would be quite amazing and innovative because a lot of humanitarian action tends to come quite late. We think, we hear a disaster happening, but it then takes often a lot of time before support gets into place, maybe 50 up to 100 days sometimes before actual responses are actually on the ground. And so this creates just so much gain in time for people, but also agency. People can actually organize a bit better how they can respond and keep their dignity in these crises.
Thanks, Stefan. And you're right. In this context, WFP were able to respond on average 100 days earlier than they have in previous years, which is a significant amount of time. And of course, the question often arises, why haven't we done this before? Similarly, why is the evidence base on this so thin? So, Ruth, I wanted you to come in to reflect on why it's challenging to conduct impact evaluations in the humanitarian sector, and what are some of the ways in which we can overcome these challenges?
Yeah, well, I think sort of as Stefan just outlined, when an emergency occurs, everything is thrown into disarray, and that includes, ability to collect data, to think about how to to evaluate the sorts of emergency responses that are being put in place. The fact that things are moving very quickly can make it very hard to plan an evaluation, as well as actually just, managing the logistics of conducting a survey and implementing an evaluation design. So I think one thing that we can do, and we can talk a bit about how that played out in this situation, is being ready with evaluation plans for emergencies, sort of, an anticipatory evaluation designs, as it were, to match anticipatory support. So designs that will only be activated when an emergency actually occurs, but be ready with the thinking and the planning and the infrastructure in place needed to conduct evaluations as and when needed. So that's one reflection. A second reflection is that, I think something, and I know, from conversations with you, Ashley, as we were doing this work, this is something that we came across quite a bit, was this, there's this very strong humanitarian principle to meet any need that is found. And that feels like that runs very counter to to randomizing who does and who doesn't get support. And so it's a bit of a clash culturally that there's a dialogue that needs to happen there to see, well, how do we manage to fit these two ideas together in a way that's comfortable for both people implementing support and also meets the needs of a good, rigorous research design. But that said, I think, more and more, we are able to do that, and having that conversation and strong recognition that, when the need is so much greater than the supply of support, there often isn't really any fair way of rationalizing who gets support and who doesn't, and randomizing who receives support can be really quite appropriate in that kind of context. Also, the possibility of using regression discontinuity design approaches around the cutoffs that determine whose need is being met and isn't being met. And in our case, we used, a feature of the rollout that created a somewhat random element in who was treated and who wasn't, by virtue of we'll probably come to talking about this as we talk more about our evaluation, but which households were able to receive the payments through the mobile money providers that were being used.
Thanks, Ruth. Yes, so in our context, we drew on a quasi-experimental design whereby households who, due to the fact that the World Food Programme had to use only a single mobile money provider to deliver the cash transfer, and despite the prevalence of a large number of mobile wallet providers in the context in which we were operating, it meant that some people were given cash and others were not, despite being similar in terms of their vulnerability and both being on pre-existing lists. So this really gave us an opportunity to come up with a valid control group and hence measure the impact of these cash transfers. So let me now turn to Ben to share what are some of the results that excite you most in our paper.
Thanks, Ashley. For me, honestly, I think there's so many results that are exciting because we're evaluating such a novel intervention here. But I'd say overall something that stands out is just how long-lived and broad some of the effects that we find are, especially considering that this is quite a small one-off cash transfer. So firstly, we find sort of strong effects on food security. The cash reduced the number of days and the number of households that were going without eating during the flood. But beyond this, even though we only measure welfare outcomes 3 months later, we find that the transfer significantly increased the number of meals that children were eating and whether they had access to 3 meals in a day. And since childhood nutrition is so important to longer term development, I think this result alone is something to celebrate. But we also find, treated households experienced less asset loss and damage, and in particular the productive assets like livestock and poultry that are very important in this context. They were also reporting higher life satisfaction 3 months later, and we find some evidence that the transfer helped with recovery too. So treated households were more likely to replant crops, and they were more likely to be participating in labour markets after the flood. And I think, taking all these results together would be really surprising and even unbelievable in ordinary times. But when we consider the crucial timing of the transfer relative to the flood, these results can sort of in part be explained by the fact that the recipients were able to take different actions at this critical juncture in time. And at least all the data that we collect in surveys supports this idea, because households receiving the transfer were more likely to take preemptive actions. They took more actions. They were more likely to stock up on food and evacuate themselves or livestock in anticipation of the flood.
Yeah, so I want to add something to it, to what Ben is saying, is because, of course, what we ended up doing was an impact evaluation. But implicitly, we also report almost a bit like a process evaluation. And I can't help it that where I start with being excited is actually just the fact that we could document and very carefully then later on show the impact of it, of something that is so original, something that was rarely done, which is basically, can you on the basis of forecast models of hydrology, together with digital payments that is fairly recently being rolled out in form of digital wallets in Bangladesh, can we get this cash in time? Does it work? Do we see that the people actually are getting it? The percentage of people who got what we are meant to get was close to 100%. And then on top of that, can we then show that something that is so actually quite new and innovative in this whole sector, well, actually it does something proper. It may not be massive as effects, but as Ben was saying, there's lots of different things where we show this is exactly what we would have hoped to do, that it actually can change something, not least what you were saying, Ashley, earlier. Normally, the WFP comes 100 days late. And so just the fact that you can actually document, look, this really makes a difference, coming in time and doing this carefully and using the science, using whatever techniques you have, carefully plan ahead, you can actually get the support there and it makes a difference. Maybe not a massive difference, but in all our results, it is a difference, and it is a size effect that is meaningful.
Thanks, Ben and Stefan. So in sum, yes, we saw that the cash transfer, despite being quite small, reduced food insecurity during the floods, but also had welfare impacts later on, and households reported taking more action before the floods. So taken together, this suggests that the timing of the cash transfers really matter. Our paper inspired many conversations and also came across some interesting reactions, as well as facing quite a few challenges whilst conducting the research. Ruth, I'm curious, what were some of your reflections of some of the challenges we faced, whether it was in analysis, data collection, or even sharing of results?
So I think, one key challenge that we had was that the Anticipatory Action Plan was signed just days actually before the trigger was activated. So these monsoon floods that occurred happened right at the beginning of the monsoon season. So we just hadn't had the time to fully prepare a contingent evaluation plan. Also, implementing agencies hadn't fully prepared their interventions and how they were going to reach households in the event that the trigger was activated, and then suddenly the trigger was activated. So just as they were sort of updating their rollout plans and thinking about how they were going to reach households, which households they were going to reach, we also had to be iterating on the design of the evaluation and updating the design. So that was definitely a challenge that I'm very happy that we were able to overcome, because it wasn't for sure that we would at the beginning. The second challenge was also that because all of this was happening very quickly, what was also happening in the summer of 2020, which was during COVID. So there was very strong mobility restrictions. We had to find a survey firm that could implement high quality phone surveys quickly, that could advise us well on which questions would and wouldn't work, that had very well trained enumerators that were ready to start surveying quickly. So that was a big challenge, but I do sort of want to use reflecting on that challenge to really give a big shout out to the data collection firm that we worked with, Data, in Bangladesh, an incredibly high quality data firm that's been operating for years, that has done surveys on this topic for many years. And really, without having that firm, I'm not sure how we would have been able to do this work and ensure that we were collecting high quality data that was appropriate in the questions that were being asked, that was thoroughly done, and that was giving us the kind of data that we needed for the evaluation, even though we'd had to implement it quickly and in person. I think there's also some reflections that you alluded to, Ashley, in terms of, how our results were received. But I think it'd be really nice to hear your reflections on that.
Sure. So when we presented our results to the World Food Programme, although we were really excited that we had so many stars and so many different outcomes, we were surprised to see that they were actually quite disappointed insofar that the effects were not as large as they would have expected. Now, to be clear, when you ask the World Food Programme what is the purpose of these anticipatory cash transfers, it's really to meet an immediate food security need at the time of the floods. And there's not really an expectation of recovery or longer term results. And given that we were measuring these outcomes 3 months later, that tended to be quite widespread over a set of outcomes arising from a very small cash transfer. So to be clear, this was roughly 2 weeks of household food expenditure during floods that lasted many, many more weeks later. So I think the conversation led to a questioning of whether the amount of the cash transfer was appropriate. And in subsequent years, the World Food Programme did a reevaluation of the amount of cash transfers and have increased the cash transfers by, I think, roughly $20. And they've also rolled out a randomized trial, or at least designed a randomized trial to test the impact of receiving cash before versus after the flood, which is really the question that they were hoping to answer, but was not feasible in the context in which we were operating. So it was very exciting to see the ways in which the research was being picked up and actually shaping future policy interventions and designs, even if the response was initially a bit disappointed. So Ben, I wanted to turn to you to reflect on what are some of these other open questions that could benefit from further research. So I mentioned the size of the cash transfer, but I'm sure there's many more.
Yeah, so you also talked about sort of this question about what are the effects of an early cash transfer relative to one that comes after the shock, and there's already intervention RCTs planned to look at that question. But one of the other important questions that came up is what is the relative effect of information versus the liquidity that comes with cash. And so it's obviously a difficult question to answer and not one that we can sort of disentangle in our results. But we suspect that both these things are relevant in our context. So the cash comes with some kind of early warning of the flood, and that might encourage households to take action. But then there's also the liquidity that allows households to purchase things they might not otherwise be able to afford. And just one other question I'll mention, I think more on sort of applying this in other contexts. There's questions about where we have good enough data to sort of develop credible forecasts and to set up these kind of trigger mechanisms, and also the systems to actually deliver cash or some other kind of support ex ante.
Thanks, Ben. And I think to add to that, there's also questions of what does an anticipatory cash look like in the context of, say, a sudden onset disaster like floods versus a drought, which is much slower onset, or even in a protracted crisis setting where you have multiple droughts falling one after another. So these questions have followed a lot of the initial work that's being done on anticipatory action. I think is really pushing the envelope of what this policy instrument looks like in different contexts and different settings. Ruth, what are some of your other policy takeaways from engaging on this topic for the past couple of years?
So I think it's really around those issues you were mentioning, which is that the time, so it's not just what you do, it's when you do it. So the timing of support matters, and that when you provide support is going to be different for different contexts and disasters. So having this better sense of what do households, not just what do households need, but when do they need it? So in this context that we studied, there was a big difference between households having some support prior to the flood, and which enabled them to take certain actions during that time versus receiving it later. But I think that in a lot of contexts, disasters that we see do unfold more slowly, and the time at which households need support isn't necessarily in anticipation of the first sign that the shock is there, but they do need support at key moments. And we're very often too late with that support. And I think that's my takeaway, is not just that timing is important, but that having these triggers that sort of push everyone into action, having these sort of deadlines, these lines in the sand that you say, okay, we need to get support to households by this moment, is really important for making sure that support does reach households in the window that they need it. So I think it's both having a better sense of the timing of needs, which I think we were able to start to unpack in this paper. And I can imagine there being quite a bit more useful, probably quite descriptive work done on that, but also then being able to say, okay, well, what does that mean for the triggers that trigger action? And what does that mean for things like when you actually approve action plans and how that actually needs to happen way before, if you're going to be able to get support to households when they need it.
Great points. I am fully on board with those. Stefan, have you seen any other exciting policy innovations that are similar to the ones we evaluated, or others that show promise?
Well, it fits into a broader set of work. But the interesting thing here is that we bring something and we can evaluate it very much at a micro level. So there's been a lot of thinking for a while now about how to get somehow much more quickly cash in the hands of governments, of agencies, of NGOs, based on this kind of trigger-based systems. And what is really nice about this is that actually it completes somehow the jigsaw, because it's one thing to get money via some system with a trigger-based, for example, trigger-based insurance or trigger-based finance system in the hands of a government. What you want is really that's in the hand of people as well. And so we're getting this here. It, of course, all has led to, and definitely my experience, a lot of people being interested in this particular type of work, and then people trying this out. And Ruth has mentioned some of these kind of directions already, but it's worth then trying some more of these things out. So there's work ongoing in Niger, also with Ashley, you're involved in it, or also very much leading it, related to the timing of transfers in a context that's probably closer linked to the kind of seasonality crisis, where you start thinking more about timing and why would that matter? And then there is all kinds of work that can be done further. And we definitely have more in the pipeline on work in Bangladesh and Mozambique and in other places to do this. And I must say, based on my inbox, it seems like other people are getting quite interested in a lot of this kind of work as well. And I think this is a place where researchers, by getting early on involved in some of these evaluations, can probably also give confidence to those in the policy world who love their own business as usual, which is exposed responses, quite slow, but they know how it works, to actually trying to really do these things based on these triggers, on these forecasts even, and to be much earlier reaching people.
Thanks, Stefan. That is very much my hope too. Ruth, what are your hopes for how this research will be taken up?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that Stefan mentioned earlier, which is that one nice thing about being able to do this evaluation was being able to document the innovation. And so I think I would really like to hope that as people read this paper or learn about it, that they sort of take that on board, and this sort of innovative way of thinking about how you provide support to households in an emergency. So I think that that's one way I'd really like to see it taken up, okay, let's try this innovation out. Another hope would be, I think something else that was nice that we were able to do was to evaluate a humanitarian response, and that's not something that is normally done. So I would also really hope that sort of shows, yes, it can be done, and maybe encourages others to do it, encourages more humanitarian actors in this space to be curious about what the impacts of their support are and how they can increase that impact.
Thanks, Ruth. And thank you, Stefan and Ben, for joining us for this discussion on one of my favorite topics. Thank you for listening to the CSAE Research Podcast. We hope you'll join us for the next time. To listen to more episodes from the series, go to the CSAE website. Thank you all. Ciao.
Bye, Dan.
Thanks.
Bye, thanks.